My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm the Northeast Asia Program Associate, Northeast Asia and Pacific, I suppose you can say, Program Associate for the Asia Program. The Wilson Center, as many of you know, is the nation's official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. Like the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Memorial, it's a full-fledged presidential memorial. And the purpose of the center is to celebrate President Wilson's, or the two areas of his life that President Wilson held dear, namely good policy and good scholarship. So we have gathered here today some esteemed policy professionals and hopefully and some esteemed scholars, and they're here today to talk about trade and agriculture, and I'll introduce them now. The first is New Zealand's ambassador to the United States, the Right Honourable Mike Moore. He's also the former Prime Minister of my country, New Zealand, and he was the Prime Minister of the Fourth Labour, or Prime Minister during the Fourth Labour government, which was an incredibly reformist government in New Zealand, so in terms of trade and agriculture, so I'm sure he has some very interesting things to say about that. He was also the Director General of the World Trade Organization from 1999 until 2002, and he oversaw the launch of the Doha Development Round. He's the author of 10 books, including Saving Globalization and A World Without Walls, and he's an adjunct professor at Adelaide University and La Trobe University in Australia, or has been an adjunct professor. Our next guest is Dubong Han. He's a professor in Korea University's Department of Food and Resource Economics, and he has also advised the Korean government on WTO issues. He's currently a visiting Fulbright professor at the University of Arkansas, and he received his PhD in agricultural economics from Texas A&M University. Takashi Terada is professor of international relations at the Organization for Asian Studies, Waseda University, and after his stint here as the Wilson Center's Japan scholar, he'll be leaving for Doshisha University in Kyoto. He's also taught at the National University of Singapore and is the author or co-editor of a number of books and journals. He received his PhD from Australia National University. David Samuelson is Senior Director of Congressional Relations with the American Farm Bureau Federation here in Washington, D.C. He serves as the organization's liaison to the President's Advisory Committee on Trade Policy and Negotiations. He's also the co-chair of the Agricultural Trade Coalition and served on the USTR and USDA Agricultural Trade Advisory Committee. So please join me in welcoming our speakers to the panel today. And I'd like to start with Ambassador Moore.
Oh, right. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation. Woodrow Wilson is a fascinating guy and one of my heroes, and if any of you are interested in Versailles and what happened, which shaped the world, still is shaping the world, Versailles, there's a wonderful book written by Margaret Macmillan called The Peacemakers. She was actually Lloyd George's great-granddaughter, I think, Canadian. But it's a wonderful book, and I think I've one scene in this book where Woodrow Wilson comes back to the United States. He's ill, he's dying, and he was a wonderful speaker, and he could talk to the angels and lift the room. But when you get real tired and you're not well, you tend to read your officials' notes. Anyhow, he's speaking to the Senate, and he's trying to convince them to sign up to the League of Nations. And he's very tired, he's ill, and he gives this pretty average presentation. And then the old Wilson came back just at the end, and he waved his finger at them, and he said, "Reject this treaty and you'll break the heart of the world." Having said that, breaking the heart of the world, I move to the first principle of New Zealand trade policy. We are multilateralists. We believe in the WTO, and rejecting the Doha round is breaking the heart of the world. That is our top priority. But we're not children. We understand what the world is, and we were resistant to regional and bilateral deals for some time. Now we've become quite promiscuous over the last 15 years because we know the issues of trade diversion, and we know how costly it is not to be in the room. We're not giving up on Doha. It certainly has to be reshaped because 10 years in economic history is no longer what 10 years was. Things change so rapidly. We owe it to those locked out, the smallest countries, the poorest, to do something with that round. And one figure jumps back at me. This is World Bank figures that are now 10 years old, that if we did the deal in agriculture as presented in the Doha round, that would return 4 to 5 times more to Africa than all the overseas development assistance, all the loan write-offs put together. So it is a matter of thinking about the poorest and smallest of us all. And I think the moral imperative of the future is it's not globalisation, that's the problem, it's the anti-globalisation. It's what is a recession, but when globalisation slows down. And to bring the poorest out of the shadows into the sunlight and to have them as proper trading partners is a huge imperative. Now, having said that, we're serious people and we have to make a living in a difficult world, and we're now involved in a number of regional deals and deals outside our region. And trade is not, negotiations have not slowed down despite what's happening in Geneva. In our region, there are a number of regional deals have been concluded in the Asia Pacific, and the majority of those deals are pretty high quality. The trend has been towards regional consolidation, bringing new structure and order to the noodle bowl, rather than throwing in a few more noodles. New Zealand wants a strong United States presence in the Asia Pacific, and America's absence from the game has been a concern. We need the US to be strong economically, which in turn means we need the US to be fully engaged in the Asia Pacific region, because it is the most dynamic growth area for the next 50 years at least, as you know. So you can imagine the delight that we had when President Obama rebalanced towards the Asia Pacific at many levels, and his clear personal commitment to TPP. Once Korea, Colombia and Panama moved, we could sense more enthusiasm for this TPP negotiations. And leaders from 9 TPP countries endorsed a trade minister's report at Hawaii that said TPP would be comprehensive and would eliminate all tariffs. All is a big word. That's important. So there we have it. The agreement's benchmarks are out there. We have a work program for our negotiators. The President has publicly said, and his senior people have publicly said, they want the deal done and something on the table this year in 2012. We have benchmarks, we have guidance, we have a time frame. It's real, it's significant. I think we're moving into the 12th round of negotiations. Even with just the small group we've got, there's 400 people in a negotiation. This is not easy, but we're committed, as you can feel, towards this process and more than this process. This brings us to the question of membership. Japan, Canada, Mexico and others, a new one just last week, have indicated they want to participate in TPP. This too is a game changer. These are major economies. But those of us at the table and responsible for delivering on the time frame and the very high quality framework that our leaders endorsed in Hawaii know we have to do some work first. The US has called for public submissions on Japan, Canada and Mexico. Those expressions of interest closed on the 30th of January. New Zealand and Australia have also issued a call for public submissions. For New Zealand, the deadline for submissions is 3rd of February. Subsequent to this, we expect to be into a process which involves discussion with each of the current members to establish whether a prospective member is able to negotiate rules and market access commitments consistent with the quality of the agreement currently being negotiated. We need to know if people are ready. All tariffs, no exemptions. This is not a pre-negotiation. Exactly what happened with the United States when they expressed interest in joining P4, which was the foundation stone of TPP. Malaysia went through a similar process. The process of considering new members' interests will not be a mechanical exercise alone. There is no formula or number of boxes to be ticked, but the decision taken by TPP leaders in the Trade Ministers' report they endorse lays down some clear benchmarks. There are two questions that we'll be asking when we assess aspirant countries' preparedness to join the TPP negotiations. First, do we see clear evidence of a matching commitment to attain a high-quality agreement across all chapters, including the most sensitive matters? Second, can they join the negotiations as a highway on-ramp without dramatically slowing the negotiations down? TPP has always been an expanding model. No one ever saw it as a job in itself. But TPP membership now represents America's fourth largest trading partner. The framework endorsed by leaders in Honolulu established a very strict dress code involved, and we're going to be very old-fashioned in enforcing it. When our leaders said eliminate tariffs and other direct barriers to imports, they meant it. We cannot afford to take a low-ambition approach in an interconnected world that relies on global supply chains and constant integration. TPP is an opportunity to bring trade policy into the next generation. And we won't get to the interesting parts of the 21st century agenda without dealing with the remains of the old 20th century trade agenda. That's the reality of it. And a large part of that is agriculture. This isn't just an economic problem, it's a political problem. When leaders and trade ministers committed in Honolulu to elimination of tariffs and other barriers of trade, no one thought it was going to happen quickly or easily. Our trade minister himself has said that he cannot imagine complete adjustment taking place in anything less than a decade in the case of the most sensitive agricultural sectors. And dairy's right in there. But so is rice, so is sugar, and so is catfish. There are other sensitive sectors. And while this is a convoy, we cannot come to port if only our great interests are addressed. We know that the interests of our friends in Vietnam, Australia, and others also have to be addressed. Can I talk just a bit about dairy? New Zealand seems to be fared as some sort of dairy giant. Let's go over some of the facts. Consider this. We produce about the same amount of milk as the state of Uttar Pradesh in India. That's about 2.5% of global supply. Of course we want to increase it. So let's assume we increase our exports by 2 to 3% per year. That means in 13 years' time, we'll be able to produce another 4 to 7 million tonnes of whole milk equivalent. So what? That's equivalent to the increase in anticipated demand in India alone over the next 18 months. Our total production is about the same as world growth. We won't be able to supply. On those sums, America has much more to gain from a good dairy outcome than New Zealand. Only about 10% of growth in dairy import demand in emerging economies in recent years has gone to New Zealand. A whopping 60% of growth went to the US. We can't even keep up with growing demand in China. So why are we still the largest dairy exporter in the world? Because of the absurd trade barriers to trade in dairy. Bring those down and you'll create significant international trading opportunities, not only for us. Of course, we know that none of this will be easy. And of course, politics complicate things even more. We're all going to have to make some very hard decisions, but it'll be worth it. If we can set a new benchmark for trade agreements in the Asian Pacific world, if we get this right, TPP will become a platform for achieving a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So those of us already at the table have an important responsibility to ensure that those who come to the table can work with us to achieve the high standards and join at the pace announced by our leaders. TPP is worth too much to all of us to waste this opportunity. So let's repeat the core objective. A 21st century deal, almost an ISO 2000 deal, beyond agriculture, into supply chain, into regulatory coherence. The whole deal. No exemptions, no tariffs. A 21st century deal. I'm being a bit selfish here. I was at the first APEC ministers meeting. I saw how the wheels spun at APEC, and the big delivery every APEC meeting was a new country and a new complication. I've seen the wheels spin in Geneva, not because we're bad people. Most of us want to do the deal, but because some dear friends can't do the deal. It's asking too much at this time for them. Now, we're serious in Washington. Our TPP ambassadors meet as colleagues frequently. There's another meeting coming up soon in Melbourne. We believe the administration wants to see this thing done. But being done, it'll never be done. Do it, bank it, add to it. Hopefully very, very quickly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Ambassador, would you mind?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, our next speaker is Dubong Han from the University of Korea.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. It is my pleasure to come here to present about Korean agriculture and the progress agricultural trade liberalization in Korea. The content I just briefly explained the situation of Korean agriculture and the progress and the prospect of Korean agricultural trade liberalization and agricultural agreement with the major FTA, and I discussed a little bit about the TPP position of Korea and implication and suggestions. Korean economy enjoyed a rapid growth under the GATT system. But after Uruguay round agreement, Korean agriculture has declined. We had a problem, and we enjoyed a very advanced society in the industry area, but still rural economy is underdeveloped. This study will look at today is the Korean agricultural situation and issue and analyze the progress agricultural trade liberalization on FTA and TPP. Right now, Korea actively participate in the free trade agreement. It gives the new opportunity to take up another economic growth in the Korea. But we have the strong objection from the Farmers Association. Why we, farmers organization, is object to the FTA and the agricultural trade liberalization? Our grain self-sufficiency ratio just 27%, but rice is 98%. If without rice, our self-sufficiency ratio is below 5%. Therefore, Korean farmer is concerned about the rice market. And also the problem is Korean young people change the dietary pattern to they just like the westernized dietary pattern. So therefore, rice consumption, rice production has declined. And also agricultural liberalization after Uruguay round is give the damage to the Korean farm sector. And recently, food and energy price uncertainty make a concern to the Korean society on the food security and the energy security concern. This is we have the increasing demand of the meat, and we have the insufficient production capacity for feed grain is decline the food self-sufficiency ratio every year. So look at the grains supply demand the Korean situation. Korea import is 3 times of the Korean total production of the grain. And the self-sufficiency ratio is total grain 27%, rice 28%, but wheat is just 0.5%, corn is 1%. Rice is very important in Korea. The biggest part in agriculture, about 70% of farm revenue come from the rice production. And also, rice is a very important major staple in Korea. About more than 45% calorie intake in the Korean consumer come from the rice consumption. The rice situation is not good because rice consumption has decreased dramatically since 2000s. Therefore, production has decreased. But Korea is recently actively involved in the FTA because world economy is very uncertain. Korea is a highly dependent export. Therefore, Korea is expanded our external market. So we actively participate in the FTA in this government. But this agricultural case is after Uruguay round we have a problem. So therefore Korea rice is very important. Korea extends the rice market. Korea exempt rice market tariffication for 10 years until from the 1995 to 2004. But we have another negotiation. We extend the rice tariffication exemption to next 10 years until 2015. So after 2015, Korea would open the rice market with the tariffication. Right now is our agricultural concern and is food security because of low grain self-sufficiency and the fall of the rice economy and the rising and uncertain global price and the trade liberalization is increased food security concern in Korean society. We just look at the agricultural trade liberalization process in Korea. Korean economy enjoy the GATT system. So but in the 8th round of the GATT is include the agriculture for the trade liberalization because there is a lot of the agricultural problem in the EU and the United States, and they'd like to expand the external market. So that is one reason. But WTO has there is a more in the Uruguay round conclude with the discussion between the EU and America is a major group, but WTO is more complicated. We have the developing countries and a lot of the Brazil, India, and it is not easy. And also member country is 156, and negotiation area is 10. But it's a single undertaking process of WTO has a problem. How do you make a conclusion is in one shot in the maybe 156 country 10 negotiation area. It is not easy. So therefore, is a standstill of the WTO DDA negotiation, DDA round. Therefore, maybe WTO lose the power. Therefore, is in the late 1990s, FTA is rising in the world. So the Korea has also been actively pursuing the free trade agreement since early 2000s. Korean strategy of the FTA. First, FTA with the large advanced economies, such as Korea may successfully conclude the FTA negotiation with the United States and the EU, and we are trying to make a negotiation with China too. And we are trying to the high and wide level of the liberalization, and we make a simultaneous negotiation with many countries, and we'd like the Korea government to respect the communication with the public and the private sectors. And the progress of the FTA in Korea is we have the 7 countries FTA in effect: Chile first, Singapore, EFTA, ASEAN, India, EU, Peru, and we conclude the one FTA with the United States. We wait the congressional ratification in maybe early this year, and we have Korea negotiated about 7 countries for the FTA: Canada, Mexico, the GCC, Australia, New Zealand, Colombia, Turkey. We consider FTA with the 12 countries. So the Korea is highly Korea actively participate in the free trade agreement. But is what I just explained about the Korea position of the TPP. In 2005, is 4 countries conclude to eliminate the all tariff until the 2015. But it's 4 countries easy, relatively easy. But it's 2000. It is another story. United States expressed participation in negotiation in 2008, and other Australia, Peru, Vietnam, Malaysia participated in. And recently is Japan, Canada, Mexico is expressed their opinion on the TPP participation. Particularly, TPP, it is the hardest issue in Japan. Japan I had already 2 seminars, and the last March 19, just after Fukushima is an earthquake. So I went to the Kyushu University. I present a paper, and I had another paper in the Waseda University. Is middle of the July, and they a lot of my Japanese friends asked a lot of the Korean inside data about Korean agricultural import, because they are very concerned about TPP. Korea president is mentioned the interest joining in the TPP in the 2010 APEC meeting, and therefore Korea government start the president is the start first. He was a businessman in the Hyundai. He was CEO of the Hyundai Corporation, so he's always move fast. So the government is start the study after the president's interest. But it's the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Forestry, Fishery is expressed objection is against the TPP because we already have a FTA with the 50 negotiation and conclude with the 50 countries. So there is no more. There is a little benefit to the Korea. That is our opinion. But most of the TPP countries is very strong in the agriculture. It is a big damage to agriculture. That is a Korean agriculture. Korean Food and Agriculture, Forest Fishery Ministry position. So I just look at the major FTA and look at the TPP. And Chile FTA is the first FTA in Korea. There is a lot of the debate in the Korean society. Farmer is demonstrate a long time, but we introduce the flexibility of the fruits and the livestock. So we have the several exceptions, rice, and we introduce seasonal tariff on the grape, and the discussion. There is a lot of discussion. We delay the discussion on the after Doha round conclusion to the livestock liberalization, and we introduced quota and tariff, and we have the long times for tariff elimination. There is a short-term tariff elimination under 5 years is of just 44%. This is the concession types and example. But it's an assessment of the Korea-Chile FTA. The Korea government, it is the first FTA. Korea government introduced a lot of the compensation policy for closing the inefficient grape and kiwi peach orchard, so that it improved the productivity and is encouraged the early retirement of the old farmers. And therefore, there is no serious impact on agriculture, but is a major importing commodity from Chile, such as pork, grape, red wine, kiwi, and others are growing after the FTA. Korea does not produce the enough grape and pork and kiwi. That is a benefit for the consumer. And the Korea-U.S. FTA is a agreement is the highest level of the concession. And another case is we've concluded in the July of the 2007, but is the U.S. government asked the renegotiation on the car. So the Korea extended 2 more years to eliminate the pork tariff by the U.S. insist. But it is not good precedent to negotiation, FTA negotiation for the future, because other big countries like China and Japan ask the renegotiation like United States. But we expect severe damage on farm sector, so the 70% in livestock, 23% on fruit. But the government is introduced $20 billion government support for next 10 years. Korea-EU FTA. EU is much easier make easy negotiation with the Korea government, because they have already the Korea-US negotiation FTA result. So the EU asked us at the same level of the concession like United States. So that two FTA result is very similar. But Korea still introduced the flexibility, is like rice in the United States and the EU FTA, and still is Korea-EU FTA will make the considerable impact on agriculture, about 1/3 of the Korea-US FTA damages. But most of damage of the Korea-US FTA to Korean agriculture on the livestock. Therefore, Korea government is introduced a compensation policy for the livestock for 10 years. Korea government introduced $2 billion. But we look at the 7 concluded FTA result. So the general exception for the tariff elimination case, Korea-US FTA is the smallest, 2%. Korea-EU is 5%. But instantaneous tariff elimination is Korea-EU FTA is the highest, 42%. But the first Chile is just 15%. I discussed. This is my personal position about. I listened the government debate, or I just aggregate some academics discussion. But right now is about 12 countries expressed. Right now 10 countries involved in the negotiation process, and 12 countries expressed interest joining the TPP. Therefore, it is difficult to predict the future of the TPP. This is more country involved in the TPP, but it is a complex situation now, and also China position is another challenge. I think China may express joining the TPP, or China expand their influence to the Asian area in other way. So, but Korea has involved more than 50 FTAs. So Korea government does not hurry up joining the TPP now. I think in the near future, TPP would create the new trade environment in Asian Pacific region. Korea should consider the participation of TPP after looking at the process of the TPP negotiation. This is my point on the TPP. The implication of the trade liberalization in Korea, agricultural trade liberalization cannot be evaluated negatively in Korea because there is no serious damages, and the Korea government introduced massive structural change, and it changed the farmer's mind. And also, Korea government give the more fiscal support on agriculture. That is my suggestion. We need to, before discussing trade liberalization, TPP, and we need to balance between agriculture, trade liberalization and the public value of the agriculture. So that we have the concern about the food safety for public health, and we concern about the food security. Food security is just strive for the various viewpoints. For example, national food security and household security and regional security. So a lot of the poor people in the United States have trouble to have the quality, high quality of food. And we need communication with the stakeholder like farmers organization, and we need ex-ante trade evaluation before the market opening. Thank you very much. Sure. Sorry.
Very good afternoon. I'm currently staying here at the Japan Scholar. Although I'm not a specialist on agriculture or agriculture economy, again, as someone who are receiving some facilities or services from the center, I have no choice but accept Bryce's order in a sense. But when I got to this idea, my first impression is, again, TPP. But to be frank, this is not first time for me to talk about TPP, even in this city. Well, actually, within the last 2 years, but this is first time for me to talk about something related to TPP. Sorry, what's going to okay. But I can say TPP is probably the most well-known English acronym abbreviation in Japanese society now. Even schoolboys, girls know it, not to mention to farmers, even though they were too busy to have a look at the international news. But probably most of them don't know what TPP stands for. But it's, they believe probably something which might be helpful for Japanese economy, which might, get rid of their jobs. So there are two, the different ideas exist. But suddenly, as this, conference focused upon agriculture is, the major stumbling block, Japan's participation. But as you know, our Prime Minister made an announcement just in eve of APEC Honolulu meeting. Japan would be committed to the consultation with TPP member countries. Again, internationally, it is an expression of Japan's intent to join the TPP. But however, people in supporting the agriculture protections, societies, governments, even politicians believe, Prime Minister never mentioned participation. Even in his, the policy platform speech, just last month, just before the President Obama's speech here. He never mentioned participation in TPP, just consultations. So this is a very careful way of avoiding the saying we are doing it or not. This is very typical Japanese ways. But complexity is always coming from the complexity in the domestic politics. So this is something which I'd like to address today. Okay, why we are hoping to join TPP? Well, a number of reasons exist. Probably one of the most well-known ideas is actually the coming from the exporters. Well, we have now suffering from so-called 8 hardships. It is used to be 6. But an earthquake and created a few more, as well as domestic political turmoils. We are seeing a number of different prime ministers, different ministers. Simply they are too busy at home, not to mention to the international agendas. But nevertheless, the TPP is coming thanks to American pressure, or maybe New Zealand pressure. Maybe not New Zealand, probably. But New Zealand is now becoming famous and as a member of TPP in a Japanese society. Anyway, so exporters believed TPP might help overcome or surmount some of the problems they are facing at the moment, which I just listed here. Again, left behind. This is the title of the materials prepared by the Japanese government, METI. 3 nations highlighted here. And major target is actually South Korea, as Professor Han just introduced in the previous sessions. Korea actually went ahead, particularly signing the FTAs with EU and the United States. A major factor behind Japan's growing interest, or maybe urgent need to be involved in the TPPs. Currently, the Japan's FTA member countries, pact in effect, just this side, just 16.5%. That means more than 85%, near 85%, Japan still needs to pay tariffs when we're exporting. But Koreans, just this good dark side, enjoying the nearly more than 60% of the trading partners would provide the tariff-free concessions. And again, Korean, Japanese, manufacturing product, they are competing with each other. The ratio is about 70%, very, very high. And the closest nations, geographically speaking. So, it's easy for Japan to have a look at the Korea moving quite rapidly to the FTA expanding. Particularly, I think the US-Korea FTA is not probably causing so much problem at the moment. But I think the EU-Korea FTA, this is a major problem for Japan. Because the EU's tariffs are still quite high on automobiles and also the flat TVs. They are 2 major Japanese exporting products, while Korean does. And as I wrote here, the 10% tariffs on automobiles in Europe will be removed in 5 years, and 4% on auto parts spontaneously. I think the latter part is very significant. Now, Korea actually has suffered from the chronic large trade deficit against Japan, because a lot of Japanese parts, not only automobiles, but also electricity, are going into the Korean industries. So this is one of the reasons why the Korea has becoming hesitant to go ahead with Japan FTA, although it started in 1998. Already 14 years, but negotiation has not done yet. Maybe political historical problem exists, but even economic and industrial problems also hampering the negotiations from going on. And in this case, Europe, automobile parts or electricity parts might be coming into South Korea because tariff would be 0, replacing Japanese automobile parts. So again, this is another concern on the part of Japanese exporters, particularly parts industries. Another one is major automobile companies. We have now 8. Probably we can the list up now. But Mazda is very interesting because Mazda's headquarters is located in Hiroshima. We cannot call Hiroshima as, well, maybe urban cities, but they're just surrounded by a lot of mountains and rice fields. But Mazda doesn't have any factory in Europe. That means they have to produce and export their product to Europe. Actually, 30% of the exports are actually going into Europe. And if EU, Korea, based on that, eliminate tariffs in 5 years, again, they would be in trouble. So EU-Korea FTA is a major now concern for the Japanese exporter, particularly automobiles. Okay, we can go ahead. But, as I mentioned before, stumbling blocks, agriculture. Japan had so far 8, 9 FTAs with most of them, all of them, I have to say, developing countries. ASEAN 7, ASEAN as a whole, Mexico, Chile, and Switzerland. And there are now currently 940 items. All of them were excluded from the tariff concessions on the part of Japan with those all FTA partners. And more than 90% is agriculture, including rice. So therefore, Japan's concessions to those developing countries of FTA partner of Japan actually they are lower than their concessions against Japan. They are developing countries, but their concession rate is more than 90%, yes, inconsistent with GATT Article 24. But if you look at the Japanese concessions, with all FTAs which Japan has so far concluded, it's less than 90%. But the 90% rule, according to the GATT Article 24, is actually calculated on both ways of trade. So therefore, Japan's, the declaration, no, our FTA is consistent with WTO rules, it's actually saved by our FTA partners. And major reason was Japan couldn't make any concessions to agricultural products. So this is in Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, all actually the agreed to exclude the agricultural key product, particularly Thailand, the world's largest rice exporter. But Japan made sort of some of the weapons, economic cooperations, and accepting a number of those countries, as a trainees in the Japanese factories. Instead, Japan forced them to give up some of the agriculture sectors. But I have to say, well, this is some of the small statistics. Japan's agriculture sector is heavily protected. My answer is yes, maybe no as well. Again, total average tariff ratio last year, 2 years ago, it's a 4.9%. And mineral and industrial, this means non-agriculture sectors, tariff ratio 2.5%. It's lower than US, lower than EU, and lower than Korea. So this means, the agriculture maybe tariff ratio contributed to Japan's overall tariff ratio becoming a bit higher. But nevertheless, most of the vegetables and fruits are 0 or less than 3%. If you go to Japanese supermarket, you can easily find Japanese veggies and fruits, together with say Mexican avocados, which we came to now enjoy with a very low prices, thanks to Japan-Mexico FTA. But exceptions there, of course, as I wrote here, sweet potatoes, 12%, or onions, and 9%. So average tariff ratio on agriculture, how much? It's 20%, 21%. Korea is nearly 50%, much lower, half size. EU, 14%. Okay, lower than Japan's, but still not so bad compared with them. So point is, image that the Japanese agriculture sectors has been highly protected came from the fact that only limited number of the agricultures are very heavily, substantially protected. Here it is. So this is the tariff ratio. But rice is well known, 778%. I don't want to say this particularly, ambassador here. Butter, 360%. I'm so sorry. And sugars, well, American should be okay, but if they were Australian here, I'm so sorry. Again, these items are simply, we cannot make any concessions and FTAs. But, as Ambassador mentioned, no exceptions if we want to join TPP. So how we can make a compromise, politically speaking. Well, just to highlighted rice politics, because rice is probably an icon for the Japanese agriculture protections. But interestingly, rice covers only 20% of the total amount of agricultural output of Japan. It's not majority. But problem is the number of rice producers. This accounts for nearly 50%. They have influence. And also the number of part-timers is much larger than other farming products. Rice is 38%. That means rice producers in Japan have their major jobs. When I made a speech in TPP in Hiroshima, again, I appeal Mazda is important in front of the farmers because their relatives, sons, and daughters are working in Mazda factories. Even some of them working in Mazda and coming back to their homes after 6 o'clock to work for their farming. Why it's possible? My interpretation is that the Japanese government maintains a higher price of the rice. Yes, they are controlling the acreage of the rice productions over the last 4 or 5 decades. Even still now so. That means Japanese rice prices has been maintained as high. Therefore, those less competitive rice producers can survive. Of course, it's related to the exemption tax if you maintain the land to be used for farming. I know that quite a few people use for the automobile parking areas, although registration is that's done as rice field. So I think now government is carefully looking at whether the agricultural field can be used for agricultural purposes. Anyway, and interestingly, average salary for rice producers it's actually higher than the normal salaried men and women. And salaried men and women pay more taxes. And interestingly, TPP will be revealing, or has been revealing, this kind of secret stories to the Japanese public. Because we are now facing and enjoying the debate, we have to change the Japanese political systems on agriculture, and also agriculture should be changed. And number of now the sectors, government, farmers, associations, even academics, has been proposing a way of changing Japanese agriculture. So in this case, TPP has nothing to do with the way the Japanese agriculture sector can be changing. But I can say without TPP, probably acceleration of this kind of mood would not be produced. Well, again, sorry, the small letters. I just try to explain agriculture iron triangles. Farmers associations, politicians, and government. Maybe time is limited, so I just try to skip. But the point is, they are always entrenched and to provide, the negative implications of TPP, particularly on agriculture. And interestingly, the opposition group to TPP includes the former Prime Minister, Hatoyama. He is well known for providing idea on East Asian community. That means free trade. This is probably beginning of the any regional integration, regional community. But now he is strongly against TPP. I don't know why. Maybe membership, East Asia integration might be okay, but maybe America is not welcome. I don't know. Farmers, what we call zenchus, just a couple of months ago, before the Prime Minister Noda's announcement, they submitted the nearly 12 million signatories against TPP. That was quite effective because those people also sending the letters to the constituent politicians, their constituencies. Your name are actually remembered for us. And MAF, Minister of Agriculture's estimate. Again, this is too much extreme because the estimate is premised with that tariff ratio would be spontaneously removed all over the world. Again, it's very unrealistic. And then, predicting 90% decrease in domestically produced rice and a complete end to Japan's sugarcane and sugar beet, obviously. But, who can actually eliminate the tariffs? Who can believe in eliminating tariffs on the sugars in the United States, for example, to please Australians? Again, politically impossible. So again, I think the math, the estimate provides some side effect, maybe reverse effect, to excessively protect the Japanese, farming sectors. Finally, can Japan eventually join TPP? Again, I'm academics. I'm not usually engaged in prediction type of questions. But again, this is a think tank. And again, I'm paid by center, well, thanks to the Japanese think tank as well. So I have to say, my impression is a bit negative. Reason number one, a general election might occur this year, depending on the consumption tax issue. Again, it's nothing to do with TPP. But the Prime Minister Noda wanted to raise the consumption tax to redress the national debt. This is his highest policy priority. But this is a very significant agenda. Therefore, Noda was forced to promise that after making the consumption tax bill passed in a diet, according to him, hopefully by March, Noda would resolve the lower house. That means election. So if election came, agriculture liberalization would be taboo. Particularly, most of the DPJ newly elected candidates were actually coming from farming, rural sectors, rural constituencies. They need farmers' votes. Yep. In this case, I think Noda or would be next prime minister would be quite saying tough time. An interesting case, number two, an FTA with Australia, the TPP member country, and only bilateral FTA negotiate at the moment with Japan. Again, one of the biggest agriculture exporters in the world. And 16 round just finished a couple of weeks ago. Still, no concession was made on a part of Japan on beef, sugar, dairy products, and etc. Without which, of course, Japan probably couldn't make any concession TPP. So if Japan were able to go ahead with Australia on FTA, there might be a possibility that Japan might be joining TPP by probably persuading or providing some of the subsidies to the Japanese farmers. And finally, if Japanese government believed TPP would be too much tough, too high to go over, Japan might be engaged in other FTAs, CJK, China-Japan-Korea FTAs. That will be probably announced next May when China-Japan-Korea summit will be held in China. China made a concession to accept the Japanese proposal. Investment treaty should be signed first. And China did it, thanks to TPP. And investment treaty would be announced first, and then going into trilateral FTA. And EU-Japan study group on FTA is also completing. So all actually moved by TPP. So in this case, TPP is not insignificant. In terms of widening the scope for Japanese trade policy, TPP certainly made a huge contribution. But whether Japan can join the TPP or not is another question. Thank you very much.
No, I'll stay here. I'm fine.
Okay.
See if it works. Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm going to do things just a little differently. I'm going to take you through an exercise that I have to do many a time. It won't take long. But what a briefing for a Farm Bureau member is like when he comes to our office and gets his briefing on the trade agenda for this year. And so I just want to cover, of course, TPP will be a major part of it, but a few of the other issues that I think put it in a bit of context for what our members, American farmers and ranchers, you know, when you're in Farm Bureau, you always say farmers and ranchers. We represent all those industries. And how I think they're looking at the trade issues this year. So I'll start off, hopefully if it all works. There we go. You've probably seen all these numbers before. Very good numbers. You don't say that a lot in agriculture in the U.S. Very good, but those are very good export numbers. About a third of the value of U.S. agriculture is now being exported. Pretty much the same numbers for forecast for this year. Certainly we have a new country up there as our number one ag export destination, a major Asia-Pacific region country. And fittingly today, a visit from an important personage from that country right here in Washington. So again, very focused on the export issues and how they're impacting U.S. agriculture. And certainly one of the things I talk about with our members is what are the factors influencing this rise in exports, which came from roughly about $50 billion in 2000 to, again, over $137 billion last year. Phenomenal rise in U.S. agricultural exports, much of which is into the Asia-Pacific region. But, of course, that's all, a lot of it's stimulated by demand, rise of the Asian economies, which has been a big draw for U.S. agricultural products, and political stability in those regions, that they're able to keep buying, keep their economies growing, keep becoming a market for U.S. agriculture. Currency issues, whether our currency, which certainly level of it helps our exports, other countries' currencies, that's something we keep a close eye on, certainly. And weather, the most important inconstant in agriculture around the world, isn't it? We're selling the amount of cotton that we sold because of weather, flooding in Pakistan and China, the amount of wheat we sold because of a lot of it due to past droughts in Russia. So that's certainly a large part of the things that we watch. Will there be better weather in the U.S., better weather around the world? Will there be more competition for U.S. agriculture? Where will prices be? Something we deal with all the time. But it's certainly a wild card in world agricultural trade. You know, something that took many years here in the U.S., but we finally got it done. The FTAs, now we're with South Korea, Colombia, and Panama. Again, something that we in Farm Bureau were very much in favor of, opening markets. And opening markets, and I think this will be important later on, in a timely manner. And that's part of what we see of what's going on in the Pacific, part of what we see with the TPP. You know, here at Farm Bureau, we did some economic forecasting about what these FTAs would mean. And a couple of them, we had to revise those downwards. We negotiated FTAs, took a while to get our Congress to put them into place. Some other countries decided negotiating FTAs with those partners was a good idea and took some of our market share while we were debating. So I think that's an issue for, say, about what are the opportunities and problems for U.S. agriculture. Our members, I think our farmers and ranchers, really want to see trade agreements that are concluded on a timely basis. We've been waiting on trade agreements, both in the FTAs And, as the ambassador started off talking about, with Doha. You know, for the first time in a long time, I won't have the words Doha in my trade agenda for this year. That's a big change. Russia. You know, we've got an issue with Russia. I won't go through all of that. In fact, just before this, I came from a meeting about that issue. What's going to happen with trying to get, you know, they're invited to be part of the WTO. Our Congress has to take some action this year. There's opportunity there for all sorts of industries, but there's also several issues around that that's going to take time in the Congress this year. China, come back to that just because it's our largest, now our largest ag export partner, and I said some of those issues before that we will have, but certainly a lot of opportunity there. Again, another part of the growth story in the Asia-Pacific region. The Farm Bill. Well, we've got something unusual in our Farm Bill this year. To an extent, we have another nation, a major one of our competitors, that's going to have some sort of a say-so in the final, how it looks. I say some sort, I'm not sure exactly how that's going to turn out, and it depends on our Congress and how they're going to act with this. But they're going to have some role in the shape of some parts of the Farm Bill, and that's different. That certainly is different. Maybe it's an example of the more interconnectedness of our world today. But now we're getting into some of the comments I want to make about the TPP, and I put new entrants there just as a shorthand for myself. I would usually say that new entrants with a rising tone is a question, especially after the last presentation. Will there be a new entrant? Starting off on that a little bit, you know, Japan is our fourth largest ag export partner, over $12 billion in U.S. agricultural trade, a long-term export destination for the United States, very good customer for a range of products, but as was pointed out, have a few barriers in certain products and some very strong barriers. Our rice producers are ever hopeful. But they certainly have a lot of work cut out for them in that. Though there is a good market for many other of our products, and you know we want to see this. Again, speaking for the American Farm Bureau, we want to see this TPP grow. We want to see it be successful in the issues that it is going to tackle in this discussion, whether they're market access issues, which is one of the promises of these new entrants. When you really think about the growth and where our trade is, again, Japan, our fourth largest trading partner. Canada, up till last year, was our first number one ag export destination. Mexico now was number two, now number three, but major U.S. agricultural export destinations. So if you added these three countries with the current trade we have in the Asia-Pacific region, if you include China and all that, it's not in the TPP, but just as a regional area, you'd have the majority of the U.S. agricultural export destinations in that region. So we are definitely an Asia-Pacific focused agricultural exporter. And that is very important to our members. And so many of our commodities depend on exports and prices driven by exports. So we look to it very strongly. And of course, we also believe that countries that join TPP need to come in to the negotiation as it is, shouldn't have exclusions, recognize this as a comprehensive agreement, be willing to work on the sanitary, phytosanitary barriers and issues that are so important to our trade that need to be modernized. We're looking for this to be as was said, a high standards agreement. And you know, when you can't make progress in some other areas, maybe you make progress here. And we think this is a place we can make progress in that. I just put these up. There's a couple slides here from our economics department which just show trends. Here's, again, where our agricultural exports are to the countries in the TPP, and the bottom in the red is with Japan. So you see it just adds to it. If you add Canada, that's their part of it, and if you add Japan and Canada, you see, look on the left, how much it grows the trade. And I didn't have a slide for Mexico, but if you add Mexico, there's another 15, 16 billion added to that. So the structure, the current structure, the future structure of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if it grows in this direction, will be of great importance to our members, to American agriculture. And I think that we have to recognize also that the regional economies are going to be so important to this. I started off by saying that. I'll sort of finish with that. Growth has been very good for American agricultural exports in those economies. Continued growth is very important. But if we see downturns, slow growth, that'll definitely have an impact on what we do there. But I think that the TPP is an opportunity to achieve freer and better trade in a very dynamic region of the world economy. It's already a large part of our agriculture and has a lot of promise for continued growth. And seeking to positively change the rules of the world market into which we sell our products is very important to us. So we will be and are watching this very closely. And our comments and a lot of the comments that the agricultural community put into the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative were very positive about the potential of the TPP and discussions of potential new entrants to 3 countries. But certainly people have continuing issues. There's always continuing issues in agriculture that need to be worked on. So we think this negotiation can handle it, and that it has a lot of potential. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks very much for your attention and for the speakers for their speeches. Before you ask your questions, I'd like you to raise your hand. There will be someone coming around with a microphone at some stage. Bob? Yep, okay. All right. And please state your name and any affiliation that you might have. We'll go first over here to Maria.
I'll just go ahead with that.
Yeah, please.
I'm Maria Solis from American University. Thank you so much for the really curious presentations. I have a question that I would like to address to both Mr. Hand and Mr. Terada, and that has to do with the question of how to bring the farmers on board with the prospect of trade liberalization. And it's very true that the comparison has always been made that Korea has gone ahead and has left Japan behind because it was able to compensate the farmers and therefore it was able to negotiate agreement with large trading partners. So the first part of my question is to Mr. Han regarding the compensation packages. Because you mentioned that it has been a positive experience and they have promoted productivity. So my question is if there is any restructuring component embedded in those compensation packages or whether it's just throwing money to the farmers. And added to that is you mentioned that it's $20 billion that's expected, that was given for the U.S. FTA. If Korea were to join the TPP, do you have any idea of what size of compensation would be required? And I wonder if there are any fiscal considerations or budgetary considerations that could prevent the Korean government from keep on giving every time an agreement is negotiated. And the question for Mr. Terada is if there is any plan.
Mireya, there's a microphone coming behind you.
If there is any plan from the Japanese government to emulate what the Koreans have done and pay off the farmers with some compensation to bring them on board. Thank you.
Every country is a support to the farmer. Whenever they introduce the new mechanism into the farm sector. For example, United States is right now is a debate, 2012 Farm Bill revision debate. They'd like to remove the direct payment, but it's look at the American Farm Bureau Federation position. I know that position. They definitely increase the farm support. I expect this is election year. Republican, maybe most of farmers' organization is try to make a lobby to increase the support. I never expect the U.S. Farm Bill never decrease. But it's last week I had a seminar about the Farm Bill debate. At the time, is definitely U.S. farmers' organization is a contribute to decreasing the budget deficit in the United States. But is every farmers' organization is try to make a lapping to increase the. They like remove the direct payment. They increase the target price and introduce the other mechanism. Japan and Korea introduced that kind of mechanism, but it's always politician and the government official cheat the farmers. Farmer is not smart enough. For example, government introduced 10 years promise, but is government always make a budget negotiation process with the Congress. But there is every 5 years, Korea government have a president election. President change. They may change the policy. So at first, Korea government to make a successful conclusion with the United States. At that time, farmer is made a fierce demonstration on the street for several months, and also Korea is decide re-importing the U.S. beef in the 2007. Therefore, government to give some pie to the farmer. Anyhow, definitely that is every country do and also. Yeah, Japanese. I just Dr. Terada is told me is Korea and Japan is a kind of dirty country in the agricultural support, but I think is that is the same country as like United States. I am trained in the agricultural economics, but you think about what percentage of agricultural college professor has a farmland. Why they have a farmland? Just to reduce the income tax. I know most of all my friend has a farmland in the farm area in the land grant university. That means about more than 30% agricultural college graduate go to farm because the farm price is very high. Farm support is very high. Therefore, farm business is the best business in the United States right now. Everybody know other business is not good in the United States, but that means all countries support the farmers in the period of the changing the policy. That is Korea is just follow the other country do. That is a normal politicians' behavior. I think is.
Well, certainly the Japanese government, particularly Minister of Agriculture, has been proposing the estimate, how much money would be necessary when Japan decided to join TPP. But in 1993, when the Uruguay round ended, Japan promised to accept so-called minimum access rights, and in lieu of that, Japan provided 6 trillion yen to farmers. Huge money. But these big money not necessarily used for helping for example young farmers they grow and etc. They sometimes use this money for onsen, hot springs, and just road for field. Yeah, it's true. So therefore, many people now they are completely opposed to the putting such big money on the farmers. But the half size currently, Minister of Agriculture said 2.8 trillion yen. But one expert said maybe 1/10 may be enough. But in this case, there's one condition. The Gentan, the control of the rice field acreage, this system should be eliminated so that rice can be produced freely by farmers. And also, this would be the way for the private companies to join. And suddenly, rice might be abundant. This could be exported, taking advantage of TPP. So now we have to consider about this compensation issue together with the proposal of the agricultural reforms. Otherwise, again, we need to probably face the situation that we need to pay 6 trillion yen. But again, we cannot afford to pay that kind of big money now because of the problem in the economy.
Bryce, if I could just add a couple of quick points. There are places that don't subsidise agriculture at all, but let's move on from that. In my comment, I made a few cheap shots in my presentation, but I did mention sugar and catfish. We do not have any catfish, we do not have any sugar as New Zealanders, but we know that, as I mentioned, our convoy has to move together, and all the members of TPP must see something in it for them. And so there are some tough calls for America on sugar and catfish in some of these areas. I would commend to the centre that maybe we can have a seminar on non-agricultural issues, because there are huge things in TPP that aren't about agriculture. I mean, for us, areas of services, trade facilitation, intellectual property, management of SOEs, these are all substantial things. Now, you've had a seminar on the toughest of the oldest issues. Maybe we ought to have a happy seminar on what the future issues are. I mean, everybody knows about New Zealand wine. I mean, we get more export income from selling manufactured yachts than we do from New Zealand wine. Our economy is slightly different. You all know of Lord of the Rings, but you may not know of the technology for Avatar and Tintin and all this other stuff. I mean, I'm not letting down the agricultural sector in New Zealand. It is still core fundamental to us. But, you know, when you see a New Zealander, don't automatically think of a pound of butter and a dead sheep.
Is that what people have been thinking of me? Oh, gosh. Okay, right, who's next? Up the back there.
Thank you very much. Charlotte Hebebrand from the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council. I think all of you have referred to the TPP as a 21st century agreement, and yet I've heard a lot of, in your presentations, on tariffs only. Could you give us a sense of what you're excited about in the TPP when it comes to some of the other issues? And arguably, I think some of the regulatory issues are probably the most important moving forward. And then a question for Dave. The countries you mention as the major countries of interest to the U.S. are not yet TPP countries. So how do you think the U.S. will deal with the issues that are sensitive for it, i.e. sugar and dairy and catfish, as I've just learned, given the existing pool of countries?
I think let's start with the first, which was on the regulatory issues. I think those are very important for agriculture in the sanitary, phytosanitary area, looking to improve the work and make sure that food sanitary regulations are science-based. The risk assessment is really solid, that this is communicated and transparent to trading partners. So I think the work there is very key, and especially if we're looking at hopefully moving away and looking at markets that are more in the fruit, vegetable area where this is more important. And so I think there's been good work going on there. I think there'll continue to be hard work there, and it's very important. It's very important, I think, for every country. Every country's who's an exporter and an importer. Everybody wants to make sure that their food is of that they're consuming and bringing in for their public is of the quality that they want and is safe. So I think that's really an important part of the agriculture-related discussions here. You asked about the issues, and I'll answer that, Charlotte, by saying there are sensitive issues that have to be worked on. And I'll leave that there. There's these issues have been around, and I guess as we've seen from past agreements, the agricultural issues usually stay around until the end of the day.
You know, I may sound a little brutal. I hope not. But a negotiation on sequence is an issue of time frames. That is a core part of a negotiation. But if we talk about small and medium business are the ones that need predictable rules of business. They need to know how they facilitate their business. If Bill Gates turns up at the airport, the Prime Minister will go and visit him and take him through. For the small business person, they need these rules. And if you think there are tough areas outside agriculture, financial services, investment, IP, government procurement, none of these are easy for any of us. Yet we have got progress in many of these areas, which surprise us. It's going to be very, very hard for some friends. Always think of the expanding model. But SOEs for some friends inside the negotiations, how they're managed in the future. These are not small things. IP is a huge issue, and there's all sorts of ripple effects. So, the point that we want a 21st century agreement, but we're going to have to carry some 20th century things through as we go. But sequencing is important, time frames are important, but principles and objectives are pretty core to the whole damn thing.
I can't believe there's not a question there. Anybody?
Rules of origin. Just the rules of origin stuff is so complicated. You know the famous iPod analysis, iPad analysis.
Yeah, I make some comment. Is the Ambassador Morris is WTO is just to contribute to the removing the tarification and the opening the market, and they do not contribute to the how to develop the developing countries' agricultural situation. So, for example, foreign aid to the developing country has decreased after in augmentation of the WTO, and also think about the food security, energy security problem. Right now is we only he mentioned about a lot of the rule making, SPS, and also is a government procurement, but we didn't progress at all. But we always debate about the domestic support and market opening debate mostly. For example, mostly the blue box is a U.S. foreign policy mechanism. So the blue box, we have the debate more than 10 years in the WTO. We didn't progress at all. So for example, we look at and our situation about why the food price is very uncertain, why energy price is very uncertain, but nobody gives any solution yet. So then maybe therefore the WTO is lose the power of the managing the world trade mechanism. Therefore, we need to discuss about a new rule of the global trade, I think is.
Well, on Doha, there's enough blame to share amongst all of us. So even though I intend to live another 50 years, we don't have time to go into who to blame on this. Enough for all of us. But maybe if we can set up some new standards here in TPP, or what you're doing, for example, our deal with China, which is going very well. We're the first developed country to do a deal. It's going extremely well. That's our experience. Perhaps some of the models we drive up, or whether it's SOEs or government procurement, could actually be of use back in Geneva in a few years' time. I mean, we are still true believers. And this group of us, and we hope it expands, are true believers. We want to do this thing, Maybe it's because we're tired of going to Geneva. And maybe we remember the Bogor goals. Remember those? 2010, 2020? Shame on us.
Okay. All right.
Wen Chong from the Green Embassy. I have a question to
Could you wait for the microphone, please?
Won-Chang-La. I have a question to Professor Terada. It has been reported that the Obama administration has asked Japanese government to work on auto, Japan Post, and rice as a some call it precondition, and the U.S. administration is now calling it confidence-building measures to show its earnest to join the TPP negotiation. But at the same time, the U.S. administration has mentioned that it does not want the negotiation or discussions with the new entrants slow down the TPP negotiation. So, I mean, do you see any breakthrough with the rice issues between the U.S. administration and Japan this year with regard to the TPP entrant issues?
Well, thank you very much. Well, this is actually, as far as I heard, what's going on in Washington, D.C. this week and next week. I think Japanese government officials are coming, and again, I'm not government official, so simply I have no idea what's going on there. But in terms of the rice, and well, to be frank, you know, I'm not so sure whether the American rice could be well consumed in a Japanese society or not. The point is, as far as I heard, 1%, you know, the Japanese eat only short-grained rice, not long ones, and produced in Japan is of short grains only. And when it comes to U.S., only 1% of the American rice is short-grained. And the point is, you know, probably they can export to the Japanese societies, but not so much. And in terms of the other statistics, you know, 3 million tons of the short-grained rice would be annually necessary. And in the worldwide, only 10 tons has been produced. So in this case, and well, personally speaking, we don't mind, you know, the opening the Japanese rice market to the world, but you know, the demand supply, you know, the index is quite, you know, one-sided, particularly when it comes to the short grain. And another thing is the rice price has been internationally community has been going down. And probably someone said, you know, in 2 years' time, the rice price at domestic market and international market might be converging. So we don't need probably protections. I'm not so sure this kind of, you know, the way of persuasion could be made by the Japanese government or not. But I think reality is we don't need to probably so much worry about it on rice, personally speaking.
Dave, did you want to say anything to that?
On the question of the rice, you know, there is some sales of rice into Japan. We'd certainly like to increase that and look for some further opening of that market. And hopefully we would be able to produce the rice that the Japanese consumer would prefer.
The consumer should decide. What's wrong with that? Can I make another point? Is it, and this is a struggle that's been going on for half a century in negotiations, and even the most staunch agricultural reformists have never said you shouldn't support some farmers. The case is supporting farming, and there are ways in which you can support farmers, and there's ways in which you can decouple and ensure it's not production-based. But, you know, I just cannot understand European Union, United States, and other dear friends, where so much of this subsidy is going to the richest people in the country. Well, I don't get it.
Yeah, Dave Fitzgerald, a retired Foreign Service, now a private consultant. Just a question about the whole TPP, but the presentations by Mr. Han and Professor Terada seem to suggest that the mood in both Korea and Japan for this type of TPP process is perhaps more complicated, and certainly there's less enthusiasm there than one might have thought when you go back to maybe November, when suddenly TPP became something that Americans began to pay attention to. Nobody really cared about TPP before the Hawaii summit and the elevation that the Obama administration gave to it, the so-called pivot to Asia, which is still bouncing around here for the last 4 months. TPP seems to be just another part of that sort of circus act. And about the idea of getting this all done by the end of 2012, many other economists in the last 3 months or so have been very pessimistic about really being able to do that. Being, you just go with what you have. The original 9 or 8 or 9 or whatever it is possible. But these larger economies like Japan, and whether Korea was ever going to come in or not, would simply delay everything. So are we in, and if there's a political election in Japan this year, which was not supposed to happen last year, when people were talking about what was going to happen in 2012 in Japan, it seems to throw everything off. And you really wonder, maybe it's all part of the 2012 U.S. presidential campaign. And you need, TPP is something to be out there and say, yeah, we're for exports, for, jobs, jobs, jobs. It's all part of that refrain. But real progress beyond the original 8 members is probably unlikely this year.
I think Korea is more concerned about the Korea-China FTA rather than the joining the TPP, because Korea-China FTA is give the more benefit to the Korean economy, I think, and also we already have a lot of the FTA negotiation agreement with the TPP member country, and also another point. Obama government is maybe ignore the international trade affairs in the middle of the 2000s, because the Obama government highly involved in the war in the Middle East. Therefore, is Obama government lose the influence in the Asian market, because China is make the free trade agreement with ASEAN and also ASEAN 3, ASEAN 6, and also China, Korea, and Japan free trade agreement. So the U.S. government is maybe scared about losing the economic power in the Asian area. That is one factor. Obama government is declare the joining the TPP, and also. Japan is Japan is very concerned about Korea active participation to the FTA, particularly the United States and EU. Therefore, is Japanese government is declared, but is a Japanese political system and the U.S. political system is very weak. So, but is a Korea president system has a power to lead the international trade affair policy. Therefore, that Japan and the Korean political system difference make a difference in the trade liberalization, in particularly FTA movement between two countries.
Thank you very much. The average public supporting ratio for TPP is actually higher than opposition, nearly 60%. So in this case, public generally support TPP, and probably they tend to believe Japan has so far enjoyed the international trade for growth. I think this the key factor has been well embedded in the Japanese societies and also debate, it seems to me. But the people who probably needed to voice against TPP quite loudly, so therefore they wrote enthusiastically. They appeared on TPP on TV to say something, quite radically. This kind of the how to say media controlling attempt has been always made by someone who are stronger against TPP. But my concern is, as the gentleman mentioned, the election. And again, it is well known and also mentioned by Japanese media that this is the U.S. presidential year, election year, and probably TPP negotiation wouldn't make so much progress. And that would be probably good for Japan because we could probably make a delay in making a decision. And there's a prediction that probably TPP would start work year 2013 or maybe 14. And that means, we don't need to make a spontaneous decision. So again, this debate are all going on in Japanese societies. So simply we are confused. But what is certain is that China is making, this is another concern, whether we can join the China's type of FTA growing in East Asia, or US pushing TPPs. This is very different, particularly in terms of the non-agricultural agendas, or WTO plus kind of agendas. In this case, Japan and the United States can work together, particularly against developing countries like Vietnam, Malaysia. We have also same problems in terms of the investment, in part in terms of the intellectual property rights. But on the other hand, when it comes to agriculture, Japan could easily work together with China. So current position is also, another final point. Who are not happy with the TPP also said TPP would not help Japan capitalize on the Asian growth. Indonesia, Thailand, China, Korea, those, the key member Asian countries are not joining TPP yet. So therefore, I think Mr. Noda went to India, China, and Korea just at the end of the last year, while the Western countries are enjoying Christmas time. And major agendas is actually trade integration, FTAs. So this is sort of the response to the criticism. TPP is not something related to the Asian growth type of the initiative. So again, with G's point, probably Japan is more encouraged to pursue FTAs with Asian countries and also TPPs, particularly in terms of the someone who really needs to export more freely.
Well, where do we want to be in 7 years' time? I'd like to think we have a Doha round concluded and all this is unnecessary. However, to me, I'll be back home, but I'd be enormously disappointed and regard this whole process as a failure if it was just the core group that began. Don't forget it began as 2, 3, 4, but the statements our leaders have made are they want to see a document this year. And we've got to do our best to get that document out this year. There are other clauses, labour, environment. All these are minefields, and we're trying to navigate our way through it. And I can only report to you the enormous goodwill of American and other negotiators at the moment. But make the point. It has always been an enlarging thing. And I must pay tribute to Japanese leadership. The debate in Japan is extremely robust. It's real hard. We've not heard these words come out of Japanese leaders before. This is very, very impressive. And Korea has had enormous problems in the last couple of years with its own deal, as opposed to some countries that want to join, who specifically say we want to join to protect what we've got now. Well, that ain't going to pass muster. Otherwise, we're just going to be a mini APEC. And then what? Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it'll make Geneva wake up.
Bob.
I'm Bob Hathaway here at the Center. I want to follow up a bit on Dave's question, made me think about it, and then Kishi's answer made me think about it even more. Suppose TPP doesn't get off the ground in the next few years. What are the non-economic ramifications of that, particularly for Asian thinking about the future of their region, for Asian assumptions about whether the United States is or is not a reliable partner, not simply an economic partner, but a diplomatic and a political and a security partner? To the extent, or given the fact that the current administration in Washington has clearly identified with TPP, if TPP falls apart or simply stalls and doesn't go anyplace, not necessarily by the end of calendar 2012, but in a couple of years, do people in the region regard this simply as another bit of indication that America is yesterday's story and they better start looking around for other arrangements to safeguard their own interests?
Well, I think your last sentence would sum up the opinion of a lot of folk. I mean, a lot of people wondering whether America is back in the game. I'm not a diplomat.
What was that, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, I'm not a diplomat, but, you know, I would have thought Colombia, Korea and Panama were no-brainers. I would have thought these were 5-minute problems. But you got there, right? And now you've got a bow wave going up. Yeah, I would have thought people would begin to wonder where is America? I would. But by the way, the word pivot is out. It's called rebalancing now.
I'll just speak for my organization and maybe a little broadly for the business community. I think we'll continue to keep the interest in this region. We certainly hope that this TPP discussion will be fruitful. We'll deal with we'll find a way to deal with the tough issues in front of it, which again, nobody says they're going to be easy to handle all of these things for all these different countries. But I think the driver of the region is so important from American Ag's point of view. Our interest is very clear, that we just believe that better trade in this region is important to American agriculture. And just as by way of, I think it fits well here, if you saw yesterday's Washington Post had a long article about U.S. agriculture's response to higher prices. And several of the farmers interviewed in this article said, yeah, if prices are great, I'm going to plant more. So as we say in agriculture, the solution to high prices is high prices. There will be more U.S. agricultural production given good weather, and that will certainly work to help modify, unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, modify those issues. So that the need for us to be an exporter and to have a system where our exports trade freely is going to continue to be of paramount importance to us.
Just the early part of the Bob's questions on the more strategic and political side of the implications in the TPP might create. Some people in Japan tried to see the President Obama's visit as a sort of the one set, starting from Honolulu, APEC, coming down to Australia, Darwin, and going into the Bali in East Asian Summit. But certainly the economic agenda has been quite highlighted by a lot of people within Japan, maybe within this country as well. But what kind of strategic implications this Mr. Obama's trip has created? And so therefore, some people in Japan say, this is very important for Japan to consider in the context of the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship, our allied, the country. And this kind of element was not necessarily popular 2 years ago. Economics, politics, security. But the China's rise has been much more aggressively noticed by the people in Japan, particularly after the territorial disputes, and this now the prevailing into the South China Sea. And now, looking at ASEAN member countries who are now TPP members, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, they are all also claiming the South China Sea against China. Singapore is not actually. And the Philippines is now interested in that. In my view, Philippines is not FTA, free trade oriented nation. But now Philippines is interested in joining TPP. Well, my guessing is it's maybe related to the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. Again, America's most strategic alignment has been already started, removing some of the Marines from Okinawa to the Guam. And now the U.S.-Japan's relationship in a partnership can be in a critical stage. And some people now worried about the future of U.S.-Japan relationship as well. So TPP might be probably considered in this case in one of the strengthen the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship. And again, starting from economic and probably more expanded to the wider strategic and political side. Well, again, this kind of school in Japan, of course, try to see China as a nation in a different society. But again, we have to also consider that China is by far the largest trading partner to Japan. So this is a source of concerns and confusion as well.
I'll make a short comment. I think the goal of the TPP is very similar to the goal of the APEC trade liberalization. We tried about 15 years ago, but APEC is involved in around 15-20 countries. It is very hard. They make almost same is 10 years tariff elimination is as same as goal of the APEC, but it is very hard. And also APEC is strive for the open regionalism, so that they try to make the trade liberalization in the region. They open that mechanism to any country. But if P4 country, Brunei, New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, doesn't have the domestic support, doesn't have the very low agricultural tariff. So it is very easy to remove all tariffication within 10 years. But if more than 10 countries would be involved in the negotiation, it would be very, very difficult to conclude like WTO. That is some economic point, negotiation point.
Very, very good. It's no accident this happened. This has been announced at APEC meetings, has been advanced at the frustration and disappointments of APEC. There's no mistake. It has been expanding. But you reach a point where how many true believers you get in the room? Now, the answer to the expansion is above my pay grade. Of course it needs to be expanded. Of course it needs to be expanded. The question is timing. The question, does it slow the show down so much that we'll get bogged down and in a couple of years just be a mini APEC? Don't know.
Right. Well, if there's one up the back there, Josh.
Right. John Hopkins from the University of Canterbury.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, John.
In New Zealand, I'm not a dead sheep.
I
am a New Zealander. A very simple question. I wonder if the fundamental problem is that the TPP has become a victim of its own success, because as it's moved into the wider Asia-Pacific region, if it happens, if you get a meaningful TPP, it won't be the sort of agreement that New Zealand and the P4 originally intended it to be. So I wonder. I suppose, is it worth the candle?
Well, we'll see. We hope to get a document up this year. Obviously, won't go to the Congress this year, but very shortly thereafter. So we'll just see. I mean, we don't want to slit our wrists before it's necessary.
Okay, right. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to call an end to things here. I'd like you to join me in thanking my guests, Ambassador Mike Moore, Du Bong Han, Takashi Terada, and David Samilton.